Now we're going to examine the role of the Women's Safety and Justice Taskforce in Queensland. What was learned from that process? What recommendations were made? And importantly, what happens now? Now, once again, the Lady Musgrave Trust hasn't just asked anyone along to talk about this topic. These two women were fairly pivotal in the whole process. Please welcome Margaret McMurdo and Cathy Taylor to the stage. So look, of course they need no introduction, but Margaret Murdoch was the President of the Court of Appeal in this state from 1998 until 2017. She was the first woman to be appointed to such a position in Australia. She's currently the Chair of the Legal Aid Queensland Board and the Board of Governors of the Queensland Community Foundation. Please welcome Margaret McMurdo. And as if that isn't enough firepower for today's panel, once that Women's Safety and Justice report was delivered to government, Cathy Taylor was appointed as the Independent Implementation Supervisor to oversee the government response to the recommendations that were made. Cathy has over 20 years of experience as a senior public servant in Queensland and South Australia. She's spent that time working in and across strategic policy, legislative reform, planning and service delivery roles in the areas of child protection, youth justice, disability services and domestic, family and sexual violence. Please welcome Cathy Taylor. Now, you'll have to forgive me, Cathy, but I'll go to Margaret first and
that's what you should say.
we'll get you to set the scene. The task force was established in March 2021, and I'm not sure about you, but my memory of the timeline of the past few years has become a bit blurry. That pandemic could have been 10 years ago and it could have been 1 year ago. Can you remind us of why this Women's Safety and Justice Task Force was created? Can you take us back to that time?
Sure. I think that's a really important thing to do because so much is happening. I mean, for some years, of course, the community had become increasingly... It's working? I've got to hold it closer. Is that better? Oh. Okay. For some years, of course, the community had become, probably over some decades really, the community had got to learn a lot more about domestic and family violence. It moved from when I started in the law, from domestic violence was considered a domestic issue and it was almost a mitigating factor in sentence rather than the exacerbating factor that it's now become. It was almost an excuse, it was private. And over years, with advocacy, through groups like you, from media interest, and the involvement of the media was very important in this, and governments too, gradually the community attitudes really changed and understood that domestic and family violence was a serious crime against the person and indeed a serious crime against the state because it had huge economic cost to the state as well as huge economic and personal cost to the victims. And most of the victims we learnt, although domestic violence can affect men, most victims were women, so it was recognised as a gendered crime. And, the media would highlight the killings of women, and people began to learn that women were being killed every week from domestic and family violence. Then I think it was in February 2020, there was that terrible killing of Hannah Clark and her 3 young children, and in their car in suburban Brisbane in the most horrific circumstances. And for many that became, right across Australia, a line in the sand, this has to stop. At the same time, things were happening in the women's movement more generally in Australia and internationally. There was the #MeToo movement with a lot of anger about sexual harassment and sexual assault and calling out things that had been happening for decades. Grace Tame became Australian of the Year and exposed the difficulties for sexual assault victims, and that was spoken about publicly and frankly in a way it hadn't been before. People looked to parliamentarians for help, but then at the same time a number of women, including Brittany Higgins, came out and made allegations about what was happening in Parliament House in Canberra, and we heard that the place where we would have hoped these things might be solved that was in fact a misogynistic and toxic workplace. Then with all those things happening, journalists like Louise Milligan wrote books like Witness about the very unsatisfactory way of treatment of victims and witnesses in the criminal justice system. And many others called out for reform of the criminal justice system. And then we moved to a year's anniversary from the death of Hannah Clark and her children, her wonderful parents who so bravely advocated about the cause of domestic and family violence and coercive control and the need for legislation against it and for more people to better understand coercive control. It's little wonder with that background, particularly as it was coming to a crescendo really over those years leading up to the task force, that the Attorney General, then Shannon Fentiman, set up the task force to do two things: to firstly look at the best legislative model against coercive control and whether domestic and family violence should be a standalone criminal offence, and also the experience of women in the criminal justice system, which was a huge topic. And the task force actually refined that down to essentially doing two things: looking at the experience of women as victims of sexual assault in the criminal justice system, and also the looking at women and girls as accused persons in the criminal justice and offenders in the criminal justice system. So, and the other thing that's important to remember is the task force, of course, wasn't just me, it was a task force. So there were 10 other members of very talented experts in their fields. There were lawyers, a criminal lawyer, a lawyer from legal aid, the Deputy Director of Public Prosecutions, a Deputy Commissioner of Police, a Professor of Social Work, a woman from the Islamic Association of Australia with a background in expertise in these fields, and domestic and family violence workers, and a disability advocates. So it was a very good representative task force, and well, perhaps that's enough to start with. That's the background to it.
Look, thank you. While I'm asking my next question, I'm just going to give you a little table. I know these flowers are beautiful, but it'll just give you the chance to put your notes down in front of you. Now, do you want to use that one as well? That might make you a bit more comfortable. Now, Margaret, I will ask you the next question as well. So throughout those task force hearings, the lived experiences of women obviously came to the fore and were recounted for you. How critical was housing in what they told you?
Yeah, well, this was a remarkable thing about the task force. The response to the task force papers that were put out on both these areas of work was phenomenal. We received over 700 submissions, and about 500 of those were from women and girls with lived experience, which was quite phenomenal. And then, of course, we had consultation throughout where we met with, I think I've just got to keep it very close, where we met with women and girls with lived experience and those who helped them and supported them. And we went as far west as Toowoomba. We went down to the Gold Coast, all through southeast Queensland, of course, up to Cairns, Townsville, Rockhampton, Mackay. We went west to Mount Isa. We went to Thursday Island and met with people from the Torres Strait. We went to Bamaga. We went to Woorabinda, and we went to I think that's covered most of it. So it was a huge amount of of area that we covered, and we really did speak to lots of people with lived experience, and we read every one of the submissions, or I read every one of the submissions that came in. So we did have this great depth of lived experience, which I think was fundamental to the recommendations of the task force. Now, as Amy said, this was in 21-22, and the thing that came through really strongly as we went across the state everywhere, whether it was in First Nations communities, in Mount Isa, the Gold Coast, the Sunshine Coast, Cairns, everywhere, Townsville, Mackay, Rockhampton, one of the first things we heard was homelessness, how difficult it was to get accommodation. And it wasn't just for disadvantaged people fleeing violence, people trying to get out of prison. It was also support workers in regional Queensland, and they weren't going there because they couldn't get accommodation. And so the disadvantage that was suffered from people in rural Queensland was exacerbated by the housing crisis. And it was unquestionably a housing crisis. The politicians we spoke to also told us about it. And I remember one in particular, the member for Noosa. She was passionate because she had the perfect storm there, where there was, of course, the demands for victims of domestic and family violence, but the COVID changes had meant that people were being pushed out, and nurses and essential workers, waiters, teachers couldn't get accommodation in Noosa. And so this was, that's when it was a layer peeled off my eyes that there was a housing crisis in Queensland. And in the report we do mention that certainly Queensland had spent less for some years in public housing than anywhere else in Australia per capita. I think it was about $121 per 100 per year in Queensland, and the average was throughout Australia was $175. So that builds up over time, and then there have been all these other factors that Amy's mentioned, and no one's mentioned Airbnb, but I think that has also been a factor as well in the whole scenario.
Now, Kathy, you are the Independent Implementation Supervisor. What does that role mean?
Best title, isn't it? It's the first time for Queensland, but certainly Victoria has had similar roles. And this is really to monitor independently from government the progress of the implementation of the recommendations. Now, if it stopped at that, I'd say to you, listen, that could be dealt with through, a checklist and all of this. It goes much further than that. The role also has to provide advice back to government about the adequacy of implementation, and also providing advice around, are there systemic issues, are there opportunities that, weren't necessarily the subject of an individual recommendation, but from a thematic perspective. And I think housing and homelessness has come up as one of those areas. So it's really interesting, Rachel. So as part of the engagement, I'm to provide through this role a report every 6 months to government. Now, I started, you gave me far more credit than I'm due. I started in the role the first week of May, and I did a handover with Linda Appelt, who was the interim independent implementation supervisor. And in fact, Linda delivered the second report, which I've got here, which I'm hoping will be released, if not today, very shortly. I've been sort of talking to everyone about it because it's really important. And I think that's the benefit of, with this second report, while Linda had finished, we took the opportunity to sit down together and really reflect upon what were the issues that were coming up for people. And overwhelmingly, whether you were talking to government departments, whether you're talking to the victim survivors, those with lived experience, whether you're talking to the very agencies that supported them, the question of housing and homelessness was a very big issue right across the board.
It's key to options, isn't it? To any individual having options.
Yeah.
And part of the recommendations and was to not only that Cathy does this, but that the government is then required to make those reports public.
Yes.
To be publicly accountable about the implementation.
And Cathy, tell me about that report. Is that the interim report on housing, or?
No. So this is really the first substantive report. It covers the period from the 1st of January this year through to the 31st of March. And it covers approximately 17 recommendations. 8 of those were being led through Justice and Attorney General, 8 being led through the Queensland Police Service, and 1 being led by, at that time, the CCC. We're now working on the next report, which covers the period through to the end of September. So much more real time in terms of, here's what the government said they were going to actually do in response. And I was really struck by the day that I went up to the current attorney, Yvette Darth, asked me to come up to Cabinet and to talk about it. And one of the things that she said, and I think this is reassuring for all of us, because the last thing any of us want is a tick and flick, right? That's just not worth it. It was, we actually need to know, are we making progress and are we being successful? And that'll be the importance. So this is really just the first 3-month report, and then we'll get into a cycle of every 6 months we'll have a report, and it'll be released once it's obviously gone through government processes, but we'll be delivering it. So for the one due the end of September, I'm due to deliver that by the 10th of November. So not a lot of time, real time, doesn't sit around, we don't sit there for 2 years, pondering. We're on real time talking to government about progress, what's working, what's not.
That's good to hear. Now, can you take us inside the cabinet room and what progress have you made and are you getting there?
Well, I think you won't be surprised to anyone if you looked at the key recommendations and the government response. There are timeframes that have been allocated to those. So quite rightly, as Margaret said, some of the foundational elements that were unpacked in the reports are obviously part and parcel of those initial recommendations that were looked at. So everything from, the drafting and the progress of legislation, the appointment of the First Nations Justice Officer and the work that's being led about what's happening for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island women and children. Also some critical investment. I think that's one of the things we're all talking about. And investment is not just the dollars, but the resources into both domestic and family violence and the sexual violence services, because there's no two ways about it. There's also been that significant uplift in the last couple of years. And how do we support those who are asking for help?
I'll take a bit of a change of tack. Margaret, when we look at the Taskforce and what you learned, can you reflect on what it means to have a deep understanding of women when you create policies and laws that affect them?
Yeah, that is also a very good question, Rachel, but because one of the things again, another layer that was peeled off my eyes through my work on the Taskforce was that the criminal justice system had really been designed by men with men's interests, self and at centre. And it's only in relatively recent years that women have been involved in the criminal justice system as lawyers, judges, etc., as women have taken a role in public life and become employed in the workforce. And now their voices are coming into it, so it's changing. So yes, I think through every aspect of modern life, the fact that women are now, their voices are now being heard and they're now in public life and they are in the workforce, then we have a change in policy because their voices are being properly heard.
Cathy, can you reflect on that? Are we seeing women reflected in policy properly?
Look, it's interesting. I think we are. We've still got good ways to go. But there's no two ways about it. I was thinking about that first question you asked Margaret, and I was thinking about my career. I was admitted as a solicitor in '88, the year before the original, domestic and family violence legislation commenced. And I can remember thinking, this is going to shift the dial. And then I took up a role heading up women's legal aid in the mid-90s. And while I've seen progress, and it's fantastic to see the progress, I still worry. And I particularly think about what's happening in the criminal justice system, the questions about, if a woman's being, remanded because we haven't got a safe place for her to be bailed to, it's all those really practical things that I just keep thinking about. When we're talking about housing stress, we're not just talking about a roof, for the family. We're talking about women who may otherwise be being, detained and they should be released, but they don't have a safe place, to be released to. So lots of progress, still a good way to go.
So great to hear that, Kathy, because as Kathy knows, that was involved in our recommendations. It was interesting, there are really strong links between the first part of our work, which was domestic and family violence, and the second part about women in the criminal justice system, because women who were accused persons and offenders, women and girls, every one of them had been a victim of domestic, family or sexual violence. And then once they became those victims, the fact that they were homeless, didn't have appropriate accommodation, made it very difficult for them. Well, it was a factor in them falling into the criminal justice system, and then not being able to get bail because they didn't have anywhere to go, so they were remanded in custody. Women in custody is the fastest growing group of people in custody. It's grown, I've forgotten what the figures are, but it's grown something like 120% for First Nations women and 80% for non-Indigenous women in the last few years in Queensland. Truly shocking.
Rachel, the other thing I was going to say is I think, and we just were reflecting about what does it mean for, First Nations women. The two groups that I've really been astounded by, and, it's funny, I was just seeing the Footprints banner up, and one of the issues for me, what is happening for older women is something that has really shifted in the last 30 years. Like I'm thinking, just the pressure and the critical need for that, but also women with a disability and really understanding, here we are, we're all big supporters of NDIS. We want choice and control, but not at a cost to an individual woman's safety. And I think that's the question. So it's good to continue to reflect and ask yourself, have we made as much change as we'd hoped for?
And what about, Kathy, I'm interested in your role a bit more. Can you just sort of paint us a picture of what your office looks like? We know you're not sitting around, but, how is it resourced and what kind of access have you got to make these changes happen?
So look, and it's a really good one to contrast because, in fact, I think it was a question the panel asked me when they appointed me, which was, unlike Victoria where the monitor had powers, how would I effectively influence in the absence of powers? First of all, it's I'd say to you, so let me tell you about the office and who we are and all of that, and also something I said at a DV conference very early in May. So we're a really small team, and I think that's entirely appropriate because when funds are being directed towards us, it means they're not being directed towards direct delivery or something else. So you've got to get the balance right. The weird thing about the team is 3 of the 4 are also named Catherine. So I can assure you that is not a prerequisite that you have to be Catherine, Kathy, Kat. It's just something very unusual. So we are, at the moment, myself and 4 staff, all different experiences. So have worked, some have worked in government, some have not worked in government, different skills. Look, what we're really trying to do is not to, we've gone back to tours. We went back, we looked at the government response. We've mapped all of the recommendations. We've gone back to all of the key players. So, for example, with Justice and Attorney General, we said to them, look, you're the lead agency on all of this. What is it going going to look like if you implemented and delivered this? Then we go and test that with non-government stakeholders, talk to those with lived experience, because you can't just take, here's the, beautifully written, articulate, documentation. No problems with access. Probably the timing intersecting with estimates at the moment means a couple of people, were unavailable, at different times. But I'm part-time. I found people to be extraordinary. In fact, I went and spent, I had worked at Legal Aid in the late 90s, and I went and spent an extraordinary hour and a half with a member of the team and really asking a lot of questions, just everything from, are women getting access to the grants of aid? Because it's not just about, it's every part of the system, and trying to do that. We're going to do some deep dives. So it's not enough to sit in Brisbane and, this is, I'm Brisbane born and bred, but it's a bloody big state and there's diversity. So we're going to do some deep dives of some of the new initiatives as well as some of the initiatives that have been around for a while. And we really want to understand, what have they delivered? Yep.
Margaret, can I get you to answer, is progress being made?
Well, I think we've got to read Kathy's reports, haven't we? We've all got to look forward to Kathy's reports. So I think that's it's one very nice thing about finishing a huge job like that was to hand it over and then see Kathy get appointed into this role. I must say I was a bit surprised when she said she was going to be 3 days a week.
I'm sure
we'll see how long that lasts.
I don't think it's going to last.
No, I don't think it's going to.
In fact, I'm always managing to put in a couple of extra days. I think you're following your lead.
No doubt. Now, the brief for my chat with these two women this morning was to have a side chat with two women who've led from the front to create change for women across Queensland. Now, I'm not sure where we'd need to travel to need a fire right now, but imagine we're in front of the fire with our glass of red wine, and I will ask that policy wand question of you both. Margaret, what would you do with that wand?
Well, obviously, I'd love to see the Taskforce recommendations meaningfully implemented, but I have to say, if I had that policy wand too, I would be doing a lot more in the youth justice and prison area, and listen to the Productivity Commission reports from the state and federal Productivity Commission reports, which say that our current model of locking up more and more people in prisons and young people in youth detention centres does not work. Unfortunately, I think I'm talking to the converted in this. It only exacerbates the problem. The statistics are clear on that, very clear on that, and much more needs to be done to invest in rehabilitation and proper accommodation and support so that they don't offend in the first place, and when they do offend, there's a holistic supportive program to get them out of custody as soon as possible and keep them out in the community and supported in proper accommodation and housing.
Strength to your arm with that wand. Kathy, it sounds like you do have one already, but how would you wave it?
Look, I think the important thing is to continue to honour the role of the Taskforce, all the women and children and others who came forward. Like, I think if you keep, thinking about the voices of all of those who shared their story, and the lovely thing is, Rachel, they've kept on writing. So only last week, someone wrote to me and said, look, I'm not satisfied with how this is going at the moment. Right. Let's catch up and talk about that. Someone else was concerned about how a particular recommendation had been interpreted, and I had to, go back to a thing. But what's important is I keep going back to all the seminal work. Like, I dive into people's, different submissions. I have a look at what the Taskforce does, look at what the government does. But if I had the policy wand, so I'll leave. I think that's a ripper that Margaret flagged. Mine would be thinking about particularly children, and how do we change their trajectory? And I keep thinking about the recent work that Ben Matthews led around the National Child Maltreatment Study with Daryl Higgins. And he talked to a whole lot of young people aged 18 to 24 and their experience of sexual violence, domestic violence, abuse and neglect. And the thing that struck me was how prevalent it was in society. And so for me, the question is, what can we do to reduce? And if we can't reduce, what can we do to really significantly mitigate it?
We, in a forum like this, it's very rare to say we have extra time, but we do have time for questions. If anybody would like to ask a question of these two panellists today, we'll get a microphone to you. Just as Kathy was answering that question, it occurred to me that one of the things that stood out in the Taskforce hearings was that shortfall in accommodation for women with boys over the age of 13 years. Can I get you to talk about that? It was something that sort of just sprung out for everyone as being an unmet need.
Yeah, it's a common difficulty for the women's shelters that are available, that are already stretched to capacity. A number of them, and it does vary from shelter to shelter, but a lot of the shelters won't take boys if they're 12 or over. That's heartbreaking, because that would be a reason why in many cases women would not leave violent relationships, so would stay there because they can't get accommodation. And pets too, that's another issue as well, that many shelters of course don't have the facilities to take pets, and women are staying in violent situations because they can't get suitable accommodation for their sons or their pets. And I mean, we should be doing better.
And Kathy, can I get you to talk to that? I think there was an amount of money that's already been allocated to that project.
Yeah, there's been some recent announcements, but again, one of our challenges is to really test, when there's an announcement about, investment and money, does that then translate into the very outcomes? Because, it's right across the board. I don't want, people having to relocate, thousands of kilometres if there is an opportunity to do something closer to home. Yeah. So we do, we're getting all the media releases, we're following up, we're asking all those challenging questions about how will this actually work. It is nice after 30 years in government to be able to now ask that very question.
We're all glad to hear it. We've got a question online. How special.
Got a question from Michelle Wiley. How do we get governments to move from populist responses to evidence-based and meaningful responses that help our communities?
Gee, I'd like to know how. I guess what we've got to do is to really educate the community more broadly, so that they don't respond to populist media articles and talkback radio shows and social media going berserk, and they actually, the communities are educated so that politicians can actually deliver policy. Because I think the problem at the moment is politicians are too afraid to deliver policy that they know is sound, in terms of the youth justice crisis, for example, because it will be unpopular in their electorate. So I guess we've got to educate the electorate more broadly. So every one of us can do that when we hear that conversation about youth crime, just engage in it. Of course, if you're a victim of youth crime, or someone is, or you've heard some terrible youth crime story, that is terrible. And if it's a serious violent crime, then people do have to be put into custody, and the issues have to be seriously sorted out. But you can't just keep locking up more and more and more people and then releasing them, keeping them there for so long that, because the system's blocked, by the time they get there, they've already served more time in custody than they'd be given in a sentence anyway, and then they're released back to the community without any support, and then they reoffend. It's just not working. It's a waste of money. And so I guess we've got to get that message out into the public, so that the politicians can feel that they won't lose their seat. And we have to try and do it in a bipartisan way so that there's not this law and order election issue with auction, with each side trying to be the toughest on crime to get re-elected, when it's not the answer and it's only going to make things worse. So it's something we've got to talk about a lot.
Hello.
Got a question. Hello, do you want to stand up? Only if you feel comfortable, but we'd love to see
A
you.
lot of things on my
Oh,
lap.
that's okay. Stay where.
Hi, I'm Carmel from Micro Projects and leading the Brisbane Zero campaign. Question to Kathy. Riffing off Kate and Amy earlier and the systems change that is needed to start to solve some of these problems, housing being at the core of it, how closely, and also riffing off Auntie Louisa, I think she's left, but the spare house in Acacia Street at Leichhardt, how closely are you working with the Department of Housing and looking at underutilisation of properties and stock repurposing, etc.? Is that something that you're on track with, or is
We're not
your
getting
scope?
into the allocation of housing and all that. However, great question. In fact, it was one of the first agencies that we were due to catch up with. And then, of course, I think it was the second week I was in the role, the machinery government changes happened. So I already had an appointment to go and see, as it was then Claire O'Connor. Ended up Mark Cridlin, who's the new Director General, said, no, I really need to meet with you. I need to talk to you. I said, Mark, I'm really interested in your processes, because what I want to understand is, what are we actually doing? And had a good catch up with them, knew the data. The question for me is, and so what? The translation to all of that. So they've actually, we've now caught up with housing. Isn't it interesting? Of all the agencies, I hadn't imagined that would be one of the agencies we'd talk to quite so much early on, but we've now talked to them a couple of times. Also to understand what are the patterns across the state, because every area is different. And it was interesting to understand, what's the Brisbane pattern. And if you're thinking about, what's happened here and, just going as opposed to what's happening in Townsville or Cairns. So working closely with them. They, as I said, they've probably been one of the areas, they knew their data, it was really interesting. So Mark didn't come by himself, he brought quite a number of the members of the team who've all got, history working in and around housing and what's more domestic and family violence, and that was good. But we won't be in there allocating. As I said, it's that arm's length independence, but they're definitely, very early jumped in with both feet.
Well, there were a number of recommendations in the second report dealing with housing, so I'm sure Kathy will be reporting.
I certainly will. And, even just thinking about the second report and, the Next Step program and a range of others, and there's the ones in the first. So, yes, we're having a look at them all, even where they're not leading, but requires housing to deliver. Yep.
We've got time for one final question.
Hi, Ella from Brisbane Youth Service. I'm the Youth Family and Domestic Violence Advocate. I'm curious whether or not you're seeing a shift to primary prevention and early intervention in the domestic and family violence response. Is there a commitment or interest from the area that you're both working in to invest in long-term sort of primary intervention, early intervention?
Well, I'm not working in the area anymore. Kathy is, so I'm going to hand over to Kathy on that one.
While there were some key recommendations about primary prevention, all of that, one of the first groups that we caught up with was with the council headed up by Vanessa Fowler and Bob Atkinson, who've got some of that, immediate work to be done. Now, whether it's primary prevention, this is one of the other things is everybody uses these terms interchangeably, between primary prevention and early intervention. And I think that's one of the areas that in talking with Vanessa and Bob, they were really saying this is the statewide council that previously had done work around implementation, and they've got responsibility about prevention. And they were very keen to go, what can we do? How do we harness bipartisan support, as Margaret said, how important that is, but also community support. So not necessarily just funded specialist agencies, but community support, the person, who's living next door to you, the builder who's up the road. And I think these are the areas that there is some work the government has to deliver on. It's one of the recommendations in Report 1 from recollection about the primary prevention plan. I know it's being led by Justice and Attorney General, but our question is, how are we going to translate that into practical action on the ground? And it's not been delivered yet. It's still underway at this time.
And in terms of education, the report certainly emphasises how essential education is before legislation is introduced so that the whole community understands it, and how important it is for young people who've disengaged from the standard education system and who are living rough to be engaged, because they need to hear this even more than everyone else.
One of the really important things, and representing young people is so important. Jan Shuard, who was the Victorian Commissioner who did a similar role, said to me, take the opportunity to hear directly from all different cohorts. So, go and actually hear from some young people about the implementation when you're trying to assess the progress. Don't just take it from the agencies themselves. The agencies will support them. So that's very important to us, is what does it look like for children and young people? Yeah.
Ella would like to come and meet you one day soon. So, ladies and gentlemen, please thank our panellists, Margaret McMurdo and Kathy Taylor. It's time.
Could I just thank Kathy for the work she's doing, and could I thank all of you for the important work that you all do? We're very lucky to have you in Queensland doing that work for us.